A new class of artificial intelligence, generative AI, has a wide range of existing and potential uses throughout healthcare. Although core ethical principles can provide a conceptual framework for the adoption of generative AI, the technology raises challenging questions that require going beyond the traditional application of those ethical principles. I'm Stephen Morrissey, managing editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, and I'm talking with Ida Sim, a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and co-director of the Joint Program in Computational Precision Health at UC Berkeley and UCSF. Dr. Sim has co-authored a perspective article about the ethics of generative AI as part of the journal series on the fundamentals of medical ethics. Dr. Sim, as you explain in your perspective article, new generative AI tools are a form of relational AI. So what's relational AI and how does it differ from predictive AI?
That is a very, very important question. And before November 2022, most of us, when we think about AI, especially in the healthcare context, think about machine learning that can make predictions, numerical predictions. For example, this patient has a 68% chance of needing transferred to an ICU in the next 24 hours. And we call that predictive analytics, and it's been very, very useful. This new class of AI called generative AI is fundamentally different. We saw that with ChatGPT bursting out on the scene in November of 2022 with something called a large language model that drove ChatGPT. And what the large language model does is it generates natural language. Just as you and I are talking right now, the machine can essentially talk to us. And it talks to us in ways that we have traditionally thought of as being human and only human. We don't even talk to our pets. So the way that we interact with other humans through language, and of course through other things through like touch and being with people physically, but language is a very fundamental medium of how we mediate our relationships to other humans. And now we have an artificial intelligence, a computer that can perform this kind of relational interaction with humans. It's fundamentally different from making a numerical prediction that we have been so comfortable before. But it raises really a different ethical calculus. And I think we need to recognize that as such and not extend the way that we've been thinking about AI before and thinking that generative AI is sort of the same thing, because fundamentally it's not the same thing.
How is this relational AI currently being used in clinical care, and how do you see it potentially being used in the future?
There are some very exciting possibilities, both today and in the future. Certainly, generative AI is drafting messages for patient portal. For example, I'm using my electronic medical record, and generative AI drafts responses to patient messages. It can draft transfer notes from teams that are on call. So for handoffs, for example, I'm sure you've read and heard about clinicians using ChatGPT to do diagnosis. And in fact, it's quite amazing the ability of generative AI in the conversational interface for one to assist with diagnosis. And that's true also for patients. Patients are using ChatGPT for diagnosing their own conditions, for managing their own conditions, for understanding their own clinical care. That is a huge, huge possibility that I think is very exciting for generative AI. Further out, one might consider that generative AI, we've been used to generative AI generating language like ChatGPT, but we also know that the same underlying technology can generate images, it can generate audio, as we've known from recent experiences, and generating video as well, fake videos, impersonations. But you can think of this also as generating perhaps an avatar of your clinician. We're all very stretched clinicians. Might there be a way to use generative AI to lean in on the relational aspects and enhance the relational aspects between patients and clinicians, or perhaps between patients and patient communities? There is a huge opportunity also to use generative AI to support community and public health workers. We can think about all the ways that we use people and skills to further both clinical care and also self care. We can see that the landscape for applying generative AI is really the entirety of medicine.
You say in your article that a plethora of ethical frameworks and guidelines exist for health AI. So, what ethical principles are relevant to generative AI? And actually, how do they overlap with the Belmont principles that have long been used in research and clinical care?
When we first started this paper, my initial reaction was perhaps the Belmont principles did not apply fully. On reflection, I think the Belmont principles, the framework of the Belmont principles certainly still do apply. So beneficence, respect for persons, and justice are still fundamentally what we need to uphold. I think what's different with generative AI, with relational AI at a first level, is that with the Belmont principles, and in the origination of the Belmont principles, that physicians were called to be the fiduciary for patients, that we were the ones who are responsible for protecting the rights of our patients, ensuring beneficence, respect for persons, and justice. And with relational AI, as we start introducing AI and its relational technologies into the patient physician relationship, in essence, the AI is almost a third person in the room. And if we look at that triumvirate of the clinical encounter, really the clinician is also a human. And the clinician is also deserving of the protections that we afford patients, the beneficence to clinicians, the respect for clinicians and our professional role, and justice in terms of distributive justice. If there are benefits to be had from AI, where do those benefits accrue to? So it's this notion that the Belmont principles do apply. We can go more specifically about how they apply in each of these three domains to relational AI. But the medical profession, I think, would be remiss if we focused on the Belmont principles and the application to AI ethics solely in the consideration of how we protect patients and health outcomes. Of course, that is absolutely central. But there are other participants in healthcare who also deserve the protections of what we've called out in the Belmont principles.
So, given these various challenges, who should be responsible for ensuring that AI tools that are used in healthcare are safe and adhere to ethical principles?
That is a very complicated question and one that I think takes a lot of care and I think is going to require structures that we don't yet have. Let's think about beneficence first of all, and we absolutely want valid and effective and safe technologies. There are emerging groups and approaches doing this, both in industry, in academia, in government. There are best practices for evaluation of AI solutions. One thing to realize, though, is that the framework that we've had of evaluation, think about the FDA evaluating drugs. And we put them through evaluation, put them through clinical trials. There's a regulatory process, and then we think they're safe and we let it loose on the market and we prescribe the drugs and we have a safety monitoring after a pharmaceutical, for example, has been released to the market. And that's a model that works for a drug that is a fixed molecular entity. The chemical nature of the drug doesn't change once we've approved it. That is really not the case with AI. AIs are algorithms that work on data. Data changes over time, and then it makes predictions or it makes generative output that actually changes over time. So one way to think about it would be, let's say if it's trying to diagnose COVID. Remember back when COVID started, the loss of smell was a pretty useful symptom that helps us to think about COVID as a diagnosis. Nowadays, of course, and we're having somewhat of a mini surge in COVID this summer, the lack of smell is not so prominent. So if you trained a model on the early days of COVID and had a diagnostic algorithm that was very accurate back in the early days of COVID, it's not going to be so accurate now. So that's an example about the nature of the disease changing, but there could be very subtle shifts. For example, if you trained a treatment algorithm on a set of patients that come to your health system, and then you perhaps purchase a different health system, and now your patient mix has changed. The accuracy of the AI solution is going to change. It's going to drift. And so we need to be thinking about evaluation, I think, in two phases. I sort of think of it as factory testing, right out of the box. Does the algorithm perform? what are its features in terms of accuracy, but then we need to deploy it in the real world. And the ultimate effect of the AI is going to be how it fits into the care practice overall, how humans react to the recommendations and the predictions and the relational interventions that come from AI. And so the output of the system overall is really an output of the AI solution of the health system and then of the individual humans that are participating in the care. And that's going to change over time. So it's actually quite a challenge to think about how to evaluate and monitor the accuracy of an AI system over time. And then, of course, we also want to look at its fairness and its lack of bias, and hopefully that it reduces rather than increases health disparities.
And then finally, and following on from that, what kind of structure are we going to need to allow health AI guidelines to keep pace with advances in the technology?
Another very challenging issue. AI is very new. It is new even for those who are in computer science. It touches on so many aspects of society in a way that is evolving. And of course, AI itself is evolving very rapidly. So, this is not a field that is stable in terms of how we can address it. And we need to have structures that are able to respond and to evolve and to be proactive. So I think while we have the existing structures like the FDA and so forth, we have the National Institute of Standards and Technology, for example, at the federal level that are very involved in technology standards, technical standards. We do need algorithmic evaluation. We also need, as I mentioned, approaches to monitoring and evaluation in the field in daily operational healthcare. And then in terms of ethics, and equity of deployment and the outcomes of AI, that requires different expertise than the technical expertise looking at algorithmic accuracy, for example. And here we need to draw on disciplines like philosophy and law and decision sciences and many, many other disciplines. And we propose in the article that there should be proactive health AI ethics centers that really keep tabs on how we manage ethics and equity going forward, and that we share best practices, and that we're nimble in being responsive to issues that arise that we can't even imagine right now. There may also be a role for something perhaps like the National Transportation Safety Board that's proactive in thinking about and preventing ethical lapses rather than the NTSB going to examine what happened in an airplane crash. Did it be far more proactive? And again, drawing on a different set of skills than perhaps a federal agency that's used to looking at the technical performance of an AI solution. Overall, we need to think about a regime that I think is going to be multifaceted. Some of it's going to be academia, some of it's industry, some of it's government, nonprofits. There are going to be many players that need to come together. It is crucial, however, that we have patients and clinicians and broad representation of society participating in a fundamental way to engage in the development and the oversight of AI ethics and equity as we go forward, because fundamentally AI needs to be worthy of trust. It needs to be trustworthy, but worthy of trust by those whom it's going to be used on, and that's all of us. So I think structures need to be developed, and we hope to have a continuing national conversation about this. And I think there's a very, very large role for medicine as a profession to engage directly. And there are many ways this could take form, whether it's professional society, certainly the medical education should think about how we build the understanding of AI ethics and equity into our training programs. There is much to be done. I think it's just crucial that we recognize that relational AI is something different and that we need to address it directly and to preserve really the humanity, the humaneness of medicine as a fundamentally human activity.
Thank you, Dr. Sim.